Verna is a teacher and content creator. She started making short videos just over a year ago in an attempt to talk about her experiences growing up. Verna used her life lessons to help promote change and growth in young people. She built an online community that has come together not only to talk about their life stories, but also laugh and have moments of shared happiness. What a delight it is to welcome you, Verna.
So apparently my phone is going to interfere with the microphone, but we'll start off with the microphone, and if it starts to be a problem, I'm just going to put it down. But God's blessed me with an incredibly loud voice, that's not going to be a problem. But good morning everyone, and first I wanted to say thank you to Sara, just first of all for putting this together, and then second for inviting me. And then second, congratulations to everyone else that's already spoken, because you kind of put the pressure on a lot now. And it's not very reassuring. But anyway, no, it's great. So, first, I want to start with a little bit of a preface. Throughout history, there have been a variety of success stories that, metaphorically speaking, come in all different shapes and sizes. If we go back to ancient times, there are countless stories of success that can be found amongst each and every civilization. Now, if you fast forward back to the present day, and again, there is an abundance of success stories that I'm sure we could all point out. These stories are not only of notable people, but also of the lay person. Success is not defined by an objective means, that is, a generic measure, but rather a subjective means, whereby success is defined by an individual's personal standards and expectations. Now, despite the term success not having a common basis in its nature, one thing it does have in common is the fact that more often than not, if you ask someone about their journey to success, quite often you'll find that the path taken was one filled with hardships and challenges, of some account. Which then brings me to my own journey to success, if you can call it that. I grew up in what some might term a not so peaceful home, an environment that was filled with so much pain that it was nothing short of depressing, to say the very least. And so, my subjective definition of success was about making sure that wherever my future led, I did not repeat history. I was adamant that I would not make the same mistakes as my parents, getting married far too young and having children long before we were at least somewhat ready. I had one goal. I wanted to be happy. Having grown up watching how miserable my family regularly were, myself included, I promised myself quite early on that I would never allow myself to lead a life in the future that equated to any sort of such misery. Although I understood that life was meant to be full of challenges and that it would not always be easy, I believed I could lead a happier adult life than I did throughout my childhood. My measure of success was and continues to be all about growth. It doesn't matter if you take one step back along the way, as long as you take 2 steps going forward. When I was first asked by Sara to write this speech, and then to later present it, I remember thinking about it and saying to myself, sure, no problem. I talk to people on the internet all the time. But then I forgot that there was a little bit of a difference. Now I had to do it in reality. And the more I started to think about it, and the more I started to write down parts of my own story, the more nervous I started to get, and I think I still am. But when I asked myself why, I began to reflect upon the contents of my story itself. And I started to remember how tiresome, challenging, and difficult the journey to my own means to success really was. But yet, also how humbling it is to remind myself of where I came from and where I now am today. Although all the ups and downs to get here have been incredibly worth it, choosing to get up here today and share with you all some of my most personal moments and memories is in fact quite daunting. And it reminds me of the quote, "I remember the days that I prayed for, the things that I now have." Not only is it daunting to have to reflect on the wounds of the past, but it is also a bewildering notion, coming to terms with the fact I really am at a place in my life today that I once could only pray for. Growing up, I never had a loving family to go home to. I had a mother who hated how much I reminded her of my father, and I had a stepfather who all too often indulged himself in blurring the lines of what it meant to be a stepfather. A set of 3 siblings, a brother and 2 sisters, to whom, aside from my pet dogs, were the only source of comfort I had in my life at the time. Now, for those of you that don't know my story very well, allow me to take you back to some 7 years ago. It's July 22nd, 2014, and I'm 20 years old today. 22 years old, and I'm not going to cry. I've decided to start rewriting my story. I must have rehearsed this like 2 or 3 times at home. I never cried, and when I wrote it, I was fine. Anyway, I've decided to start rewriting my story, to start living for myself, to stop just being an extra in someone else's story, but instead to lead down my own path. Today, I'm running away from home. I'm tired of the abuse in its many forms, and I'm tired of the excuses that I make for both my mother and my stepfather for their inability to treat me like a daughter, and instead as a complete outsider, called upon only when wanting to be used. And I'm feeling incredibly and inconsolably guilty over the fact I'm about to leave behind my 3 beautiful siblings. But the time had come. It was time for me to remove myself from all the abusive episodes and to finally set myself free. I woke up one morning after having a terrible time with my mother the night before, and I headed off to university. I called my best friend at the time, whilst I was on my way, and this friend was the only person in my life at the time who knew almost everything that was going on behind closed doors. And so, he was the only one who mostly understood just how bad everything really was. I rang, he answered, and I immediately broke down into tears, hyperventilating from how uncontrollable my emotions were in that exact moment. I remember it like it was yesterday. My mother hated me, that I was sure of, and her hatred for me was expressed daily through verbal and physical aggression. My stepfather was also abusive in his own ways, to which my mother enabled, I believe as a result of her lack of care. My best friend knew all of this, and so on this particular day, he took the opportunity to ask me to leave, to run away from home. This is something he had always wanted to ask me, but was never sure of how to go about it. He begged me to consider the fact that my family life was not normal, despite the fact that I thought it was, and in fact was quite far from acceptable. For years now, I had wanted to leave myself, but I felt trapped and at a loss for help. I didn't know where to start, not to mention the fact that I was riddled with fear at the thought of even trying, and at the prospect that I could fail terribly, and in turn make everything entirely worse than it already was. After a long and heavy conversation with my best friend, he asked if I would consider calling my father. Now, for the most part, I grew up without my father. This was through no fault of his own, but I did only ever see my father growing up throughout my primary school years on and off for a very short period of time. And then again when I was 16 for about a year. If I could liken my father to anything, it would be like the candles that constantly burn inside a church, a small symbol of hope that constantly flickers before one's prayers, like a small and subtle reminder of what could be if our hopes were to in fact one day come true. The memories I had of him growing up, even though they were few and far between, were all grounded in the feelings of the warmest and kindest heart that I had ever encountered in my life thus far. Those memories were the only things that allowed me to believe that life could get better one day, the memory of a fonder soul that existed outside my current life. And so, when my friend asked me to consider reaching out to him, I started to finally feel, just maybe, like not everything had to be this way. Now, without boring you all with the finer details, my friend was able to find my father's number that day, when he did a quick search on the internet, something I didn't think of. He calmed me down enough to call him, and when I did, he answered with that exact warm Irish tone that I remembered from when I was younger in his voice. Once he knew who I was, there was that brief moment of what felt like an overwhelming reunion over the phone. I hadn't heard from him at that point in over 6 years. An hour later, he came to my university that day, spoke to me about where his side of the family were all at, and I updated him on my life too. And finally, built up the courage to ask him if he would take me in, because, like I mentioned, I wanted to run away that day. This wasn't the first time in my life that I had tried to run away, and my father was often quite anxious at this thought, because it was in fact the 3rd time. However, my father offered me a place in his home, but proceeded to advise me of one thing. He wanted me to go back home that night, to grab all my personal documentation, such as my birth certificate and proof of graduation from school, to make the transition easier. To say that that moment in time was easy couldn't have been further from the truth. I have never found it easy to use what they call a poker face in my life. Not being fully transparent about anything has always felt like quite a deceptive thing to do, and so I all too often avoid that. To now have to go home, put on that poker face, and pretend with my mother like I hadn't just seen my father for the first time in 6 years made my stomach turn like an absolute roller coaster. However, I did, and I went home, and I packed a bag in the late hours of the night. I got no sleep, and I got up the next morning more anxious than I can ever recall being in my life. I made my mother a cup of tea as I did every morning. I went in and left it at her bedside table, and I told her that I loved her. I do believe that you should always leave every occasion on a good note. I kissed my siblings, each on their forehead. That's probably until now been the hardest experience of my life. And with shaky legs, I walked off to the bus stop around the corner, and I headed off to university for what was about to be the first day of my new rest of my life. There is, of course, so much more I could talk about, however, with 10 minutes, and hopefully I haven't gone over it yet, 10 minutes worth of time to share. Let's fast forward to that very afternoon. My classes for that day had finished. Yes, I went to them. University came first at that point, and I was ready to get the ball rolling. Another friend of mine from university came with me to the top of the library. She sat with me while I typed a goodbye letter to my mum and offered me words of support as I emailed it off. I cannot begin to express to you all how heavy the ball in my throat was after pressing that send button. For anyone that doesn't know, I'm half Arab and I'm half Irish, and my mother is the Arab in the family. And sending off an email like that to my mother was probably one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. However, I pressed that send button, I picked up the bag that I had packed the day before, and I went downstairs with a single bag on my back to meet my father, who was waiting outside for me on his motorbike. I don't think I've ever seen my father smile at me again quite as big as I did that day. I got on the back of his bike, and I'll never forget, I held on to him tight, listening to the music that was playing in my ears as we rode over the Sydney Harbour Bridge, heading back into the western suburbs. That was the very first time in my life that I ever felt like I could feel freedom in the air, metaphorically speaking, of course. It was the start for me of a new journey, my journey to success. And I knew behind me was a path that was heading down a different direction. But that day I knew things were now changing for the better. And I assure you they really did. Over the next 7 years, without sounding like too much of an egoist, I went on to graduate from 2 separate degrees. I traveled around 13 countries and even went and lived abroad for a while and worked as a teacher. Now, I'm finally writing my own story. A story that without, I know I could never have achieved I know I could never have achieved that one goal I always had, happiness. I think it's important to acknowledge that I know I could not appreciate where I am today anywhere near as much as I do, if it weren't for acknowledging and experiencing what I had throughout my past. It's a privilege I could never properly explain with just words. And with that, I want to leave you all with a brief poem that I wrote. I'm an English teacher for anyone that doesn't know. And I wrote many years ago about children and the value that I believe each and every one of them have within their stories. Allow me to be the first to tell you, my dear friend, that there is so much in the world only for us to play pretend. I have seen what toils with our minds and drives us to find anything in sight that can give us a plight. Unfortunately, my friends, it must be said that life can be just a bed of mere dread. For when a child is told that they may never be free, then it is plain to see that something else must be. What? Who knows? That is up to how your life goes. Now don't be surprised by the trauma that will arise. I assure you the ending will be nice, but every story needs just a little bit of spice. Thank you.